Imagine Windsor Castle lit in golden light, crystal chandeliers shimmering and the world's cameras fixed on a single table. A table where centuries of tradition collided with one of the most unconventional figures in modern politics. On one side sat President Donald Trump, bold and unpredictable. On the other, Princess Catherine, Kate Middleton, radiant, composed and quietly commanding. Then came the moment. A sharp exchange, subtle but undeniable, when the future Queen of England convinced the President of the United States to drop the act. Royals looked on. Whispers spread across the hall. And what unfolded was nothing short of extraordinary. Before we dive into this fascinating encounter, make sure you've hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap the notification bell so you'll never miss another royal deep dive. Share this video with friends who love history, politics, or just a great behind-the-scenes story. And of course, drop your thoughts in the comments. We love hearing your perspective. Windsor Castle does not simply host events, it absorbs them. Its stone walls, older than most nations, have witnessed wars, coronations, abdications, and treaties that shifted the course of history. And in the summer of Donald Trump's state visit to the United Kingdom, those walls prepared to record yet another story, one that blended diplomacy, spectacle, and a sudden, unexpected clash of personalities. When Air Force One touched down on British soil, the world already knew this would be no ordinary occasion. Trump, then President of the United States, brought with him a reputation for unpredictability. He was brash, direct, and often unfiltered. Royal protocol, on the other hand, is built on centuries of precision. Every bow, every handshake, every line in a speech is measured. It was a recipe for fascination, two worlds colliding under the spotlight of global attention, and Windsor Castle, that fortress of tradition, was chosen as the stage.
Windsor is more than a royal residence. It is a symbol, towering above manicured lawns. Its battlements loom over the River Thames as if reminding the world, we endure. It is the world's oldest and largest inhabited castle, a place where monarchs have lived, ruled, and been buried for nearly 1,000 years. Choosing Windsor for Trump's visit was no accident. It signaled weight, gravitas, the kind of backdrop that says, this meeting matters. Inside, St. George's Hall glittered with golden light, chandeliers suspended like frozen constellations. Tapestries whispered stories of knights and kings. Every inch of the space reminded guests of Britain's enduring monarchy and its soft power on the world stage. For Trump, a man who valued image, grandeur, and status, Windsor were both awe-inspiring and challenging. It carried an authority that even a sitting U.S. president could not ignore. The air outside the castle gates buzzed with anticipation. Motorcade don't often glide through Windsor's cobbled streets, but on this day, the black cars and flashing lights signaled more than a VIP arrival. They symbolize an intersection of two nations bound by history, yet separated by culture. Trump and First Lady Melania emerged to the sound of military precision. Red carpets unfurled. Guards in bright scarlet tunics stood like statues. The Union Jack flew proudly alongside the stars and stripes. The scene was drenched in pageantry, as though centuries of royal tradition had been choreographed for this very moment. Waiting at the gates were familiar faces. King Charles, then still the Prince of Wales, Queen Camilla, then Duchess of Cornwall, Prince William, and, of course, Princess Catherine. Together, they formed a tableau of continuity, their composure and attire reflecting the weight of history. For Trump, it was a contrast. Here stood representatives of an ancient institution built on restraint, greeting a leader famous for rejecting restraint altogether. Every handshake was scrutinized, every smile analyzed. Cameras zoomed in, commentators speculated, and across the Atlantic, millions of viewers watched. Would Trump respect the pageantry? Would the royals adapt to his style? Or would sparks fly? After the ceremonial welcome, the guests were ushered into Windsor's private room for luncheon. At first glance, it seemed routine. Polished silverware, carefully arranged centerpieces, servers moving silently between tables. But beneath the formalities, tension rippled. Trump was no stranger to making off-the-cuff remarks. Royals, meanwhile, thrive on carefully measured small talk. And yet, moments like these matter. Luncheons aren't just meals. They are stages for subtle diplomacy. Every shared laugh, every toast, every offhand comment has a potential to strengthen or strain relations. In Windsor that day, the stakes were unusually high. The world's press wasn't just waiting for official statements. It was waiting for moments. The kind of unscripted exchanges that reveal more than speeches ever could. Two approaches to power. To understand the drama of this visit, you have to see it as more than a state dinner. It was a symbolic confrontation of styles. Trump embodied loud power, the power of personality, of dominating a room, of speaking first and speaking boldly. The monarchy, on the other hand, embodied quiet power, subtle influence, centuries of survival not through force but through endurance, image, and grace. That question lingered in the air even before the famous dinner scene, and it colored every interaction. The royals knew they had to maintain decorum, no matter what the president said or did. Trump, meanwhile, wasn't known for blending into anyone else's script. The potential for sparks was inevitable. The as evening fell. Windsor prepared for its most dazzling display, the state banquet. Imagine the scene. Crystal glasses polished until they sparkled like stars, silver cutlery aligned with military precision, and candles flickering against ancient stone walls. Guests included dignitaries, politicians, ambassadors, and cultural icons, all gathered under the watchful gaze of portraits depicting centuries of kings and queens. This was no ordinary dinner. It was theater. Every gesture mattered, every gown chosen for symbolism, every speech crafted with care. For the royals, it was a chance to project tradition and unity. For Trump, it was a stage, a chance to perform not just as president, but as a figure of global attention. And yet, behind the glittering pageantry, a question lingered. Who would set the tone of the evening? Would Trump dominate, as he so often did? Or would Windsor Castle itself, through its history, its rituals, and the quiet presence of its hosts, assert its own authority? As guests settled into their seats, subtle signs of unease could already be detected. Trump was in his element, speaking expansively, making bold compliments. The royals, practiced at navigating such personalities, smiled graciously. But observant eyes noticed the moments when Princess Catherine, Kate, leaned forward, her posture perfect, her gaze steady. Those who knew her understood. Catherine doesn't command with words. She commands with presence. And though the banquet had only just begun, the stage was set for the encounter that would later steal headlines, the moment when she would quietly, gracefully, and undeniably shift the dynamic between a U.S. president and a future queen. But that moment was still ahead. For now, Windsor glowed with spectacle. Outside, the press speculated. Inside, the tension was building. Somewhere between the toast and the candlelight, history was preparing to write itself into the story of Windsor once again. The banquet at Windsor Castle was not just a dinner. It was an orchestrated performance of tradition, politics, and prestige. From the moment guests entered the towering doors of St. George's Hall, they knew they were stepping into a world where every detail was calculated, every gesture weighed, and every glance loaded with meaning. Crystal chandeliers blazed overhead, scattering light across walls lined with centuries of heraldry. Tapestries told stories of kings and battles long past, while rows of gleaming silver dishes reflected the flicker of candles. The long banquet table stretched endlessly, a glittering runway of gold cutlery, fine china, and floral arrangements crafted with almost mathematical symmetry. This was Britain showing its full majesty, not just to honor the President of the United States, but to remind the world, subtly, elegantly, that the monarchy remained one of the most enduring institutions on earth. The table itself was a sea of significance. Ambassadors, diplomats, military chiefs, cultural icons, all carefully chosen to represent both nations. Every seat carried weight. Near the center, of course, sat President Donald Trump and First Lady Melania, positioned close to King Charles and Queen Camilla. Just across from them, framed in the glow of candlelight, sat Prince William and Princess Catherine. Observers couldn't help but notice the placement. It wasn't accidental. The seating chart of a royal banquet is as carefully plotted as a chessboard, and in this arrangement, Catherine's presence opposite Trump created a quiet line of symmetry, two powerful figures staring across the table, one armed with bravado, the other with elegance. Fashion as diplomacy. Banquets are as much about what is worn as what is said. Trump appeared in white tie, the strictest and most formal of evening wear, looking every bit the head of state. Melania dazzled in a flowing gown that echoed old-world glamour, her tall frame almost statuesque beneath the chandelier light. But it was Princess Catherine who stole the visual moment. She entered in a resplendent gold lace evening coat dress, shimmering subtly as though spun from starlight itself. The silhouette, structured, regal, timeless, was perfectly suited for the future queen. And atop her head, the legendary lover's knot tiara, once worn by Diana, Princess of Wales. For those in the know, it was a statement louder than any speech. By wearing the tiara, Catherine tied herself to history, to the memory of Diana, and to the long line of queens before her. The diamonds and pearls sparkled with every movement, refracting light like a halo. If Trump was expecting to dominate the stage, he quickly learned he was sharing it with someone equally commanding, albeit in a very different way. Banquets follow a strict rhythm. Toasts, speeches, carefully orchestrated conversations between courses. When Trump rose to speak, the room leaned in. He was, as always, unpredictable. His words flowed with warmth toward the monarchy, with special attention paid to Catherine. "She is radiant," he declared, his tone admiring, almost spellbound. Cameras flashed, pens scribbled. Commentators would later dissect the compliment endlessly, but in the moment, it drew a visible ripple of reaction from the table. Royals are used to compliments, of course. But here, in the heart of Windsor Castle, in front of foreign dignitaries, the president's focus on Catherine added a personal, almost theatrical layer to the evening. Catherine, for her part, did not flinch. She smiled with composure, her posture impeccable, her eyes calm. It was a sort of smile that says, "I hear you, I acknowledge you, but I remain unshaken." Hidden undercurrents. For all its glamour, the banquet was not without tension. Every guest, from ambassadors to aides, could sense it. The collision of styles, the tug-of-war between Trump's exuberance and Windsor's formality. Body language told the story better than words. Trump leaned forward often, speaking with wide gestures, dominating space. Catherine remained upright, her shoulders square, her presence unmovable. It was not confrontation in the loud sense. It was subtler, like two magnets, one pushing, one resisting, creating an invisible current between them. Observers noted that William often glanced at his wife, as though reassured by her calm. Charles, ever the diplomat, smiled through the exchanges. But the room seemed to know. The real stage that night was not just a banquet table, but the silent dual composure between Catherine and Trump. That AS waiters carried courses of British cuisine, delicate fish, tender lamb, seasonal vegetables plated with artistry. Conversations rippled down the table. Guests whispered impressions to one another, some amused, some surprised. Was the president going too far with his compliments? Was the princess subtly reining him in? It is these small whispers that feed history. For while official speeches are recorded and remembered, it is the human interactions, the raised eyebrows, the quiet smiles, the brief pauses, that tell us where the real power shifts happen. And that night, there was a sense of something shifting. Catherine wasn't just enduring the attention. She was directing it, without saying a word. Her very presence had begun to set the boundaries of the evening. By the time dessert was served, the glow of the evening had grown heavier. Guests were charmed, yes, but also watching closely. Trump's energy was high, his words flowing freely. Catherine's calmness seemed to grow stronger in response, a silent counterbalance to the president's theatrics. And then came the moment. Not the one yet famous in headlines, but a smaller precursor, a comment made by Trump, described later by body language expert Bruce Durham as childish or impish. The exact words remain unknown, but the impact was clear. Catherine looked directly at Trump, her spine straight, her gaze unwavering. No smile, no flinch, just the steady composure of a woman who knew her role and her power. That gaze did something remarkable. According to Durham, it stripped away the president's act. For a brief moment, Trump quieted. His shoulders shifted. His posture softened. The performance dimmed. It was subtle, so subtle that many guests might not have noticed in the moment. But those who did knew they were witnessing something rare, a U.S. president yielding, however briefly, to the presence of a future queen. The banquet ended as grandly as it began, with toasts, applause, and the glitter of crystal glasses raised high. But behind the spectacle, the whispers grew louder. Reporters, aides, and even body language experts began asking, what exactly happened between Catherine and Trump at that table? Was it simply a polite exchange? Or had the Princess of Wales, with nothing more than her presence, managed to shift the power dynamic of the evening? By the time guests departed into the Windsor night, one thing was clear. This banquet would not be remembered only for its splendor, but for the quiet jewel at its center. And in the next chapter, the focus sharpens, because that fleeting look, that unshakable composure, became the spark that defined the narrative. At first glance, the Windsor Banquet looked like any other dazzling royal affair. Sparkling glasses, polished speeches, polite laughter drifting through St. George's Hall. But to those watching closely, something else was happening, something far more human and far more revealing. Because beneath the surface glamour, the evening carried an unspoken question. What happens when the most unpredictable U.S. president of modern times comes face-to-face with the future Queen of England? The answer arrived not in a grand announcement, not in a dramatic argument, but in a moment so subtle it could easily have slipped past unnoticed. According to body language expert Bruce Durham, the turning point came during casual dinner-table conversation. President Trump, animated as ever, made what Durham later described as a childish, impish-type comment. The exact words remain unrecorded. Perhaps it was a playful jab, perhaps an attempt at humor. But what mattered was not the line itself, it was the way it landed. Across the table, Catherine's reaction was immediate yet controlled. She didn't laugh politely. She didn't glance away. Instead, she straightened her already perfect posture, lifted her chin just slightly, and fixed her gaze directly on the president. It was not a glare, nor was it a smile. It was a look of unshaken composure, of quiet authority, a look that said, "This is not how we conduct ourselves here." What makes this moment so fascinating is that Catherine didn't need to raise her voice or offer verbal correction. Her strength lay in the silence, in the confidence of her demeanor. Durham put it plainly. Look how regal she looks, how straight she looks, and she is looking at Donald Trump like a childish, impish-type comment has been made. That description tells us everything. Catherine wasn't simply reacting. She was guiding the tone of the interaction. By holding her ground with dignity, she forced Trump to adjust his. And remarkably, he did. Observers noted a subtle shift. Trump's shoulders softened. His gestures grew smaller. The booming energy, the performance that so often filled a room, seemed to retreat, if only for a moment. In the quiet gravity of Catherine's presence, the act dropped away. Why did this matter so much? Because Trump and Catherine represented two entirely different styles of influence. Trump wielded loud power. His authority came from speaking boldly, commanding attention, filling silence with words and gestures. Catherine wielded quiet power. Her influence rested in restraint, in the ability to command respect not by force, but by unshakable presence. In Windsor that night, those two styles collided, and for a brief but unforgettable moment, quiet power won. Even those who hadn't noticed the exact exchange could sense the atmosphere change. The energy at Trump's side of the table eased. Conversation flowed differently. Catherine's poise seemed to ripple outward, steadying the rhythm of the evening. It wasn't domination. It wasn't humiliation. It was a recalibration. The future queen had reminded the president, without a word, that some stages are bigger than any single personality. And Windsor Castle, with its 1,000 years of history, was one of them. Why it captivated experts. When Bruce Durham shared his analysis, the media seized on it. Here was something extraordinary, a royal, often celebrated for her style and grace, being recognized instead for her authority, not in a loud or flashy way, but in the most understated form imaginable. Durham suggested that Catherine's presence had forced him to become subservient. Not in the literal sense, of course. Trump was still the president of the United States. But in that fleeting moment, the power dynamic of the conversation tilted. The implication was remarkable. A man known for dominating every room he entered, for commanding attention wherever he went, had been subtly checked, not by another politician, not by a world leader with armies or votes at their back, but by a princess armed only with composure and confidence. That look, straight posture, steady eyes, calm strength, became more than just a dinner-table moment. It became a symbol of Catherine's growing role within the monarchy. This wasn't about fashion or tiaras, though her gown and jewels were dazzling. It wasn't about protocol, though she followed it flawlessly. It was about power. Real, human power, the ability to influence, to redirect, to command respect in the most delicate of circumstances. For many, it marked a shift in how Catherine was seen. No longer just the elegant consort, she was a force in her own right. A future queen not just in title, but in presence. Trump's reaction. Of course, Trump didn't publicly acknowledge the moment. That wasn't his style. To the cameras, he remained confident, speaking warmly about the royals, complimenting Catherine's radiance. But those who watched closely understood something had shifted. For a man who thrived on dominating interactions, Windsor had given him a rare experience, being met, matched, and momentarily subdued by someone whose authority didn't need words. It was a clash he wasn't prepared for, and it was a reminder that in the world of diplomacy, power doesn't always rule. Sometimes it whispers, a moment etched into royal history. Looking back, that fleeting dinner table exchange has been replayed, dissected, and analyzed far beyond its immediate context, and rightly so, because it captures something timeless about the monarchy's enduring strength. Presidents come and go, political tides rise and fall, but the monarchy survives on something deeper, the ability to project dignity, consistency, and poise across generations. Catherine embodied that principle perfectly. In a single look, she reminded the world why the British royal family still holds such fascination and influence. It wasn't just about Trump. It wasn't even just about Catherine. It was about what happens when centuries of quiet power meet the noise of modern politics and prove that they can still hold their ground. As the banquet drew to a close, applause echoed through the hall, glasses clinked, and Windsor returned to its timeless calm. But outside those castle walls, the story was only beginning. Reporters scrambled for angles. Experts debated the subtleties. Viewers replayed clips searching for signs. And a narrative emerged that in one of the most high-stakes diplomatic dinners in recent history, Princess Catherine had quietly held her own against one of the loudest personalities on the global stage. The question now was, what did it all mean? For the monarchy? For the Anglo-American relationship? And for the world's perception of Catherine herself? Those answers would emerge not in the banquet hall, but in the days and weeks that followed. When the banquet ended, Windsor Castle returned to its timeless silence. The candles burned low, the chandeliers dimmed, and the grand hall emptied of dignitaries. Yet outside the castle walls, the echoes of that evening were just beginning to spread. Because while official speeches would be catalogued in archives, it was a subtler moment, the poised look of a princess across the table at a president, that became the story people couldn't stop talking about. Within hours, the press was abuzz. Headlines framed the night as a spectacle of diplomacy, fashion, and history. But tucked inside those reports was a detail that drew the most attention. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, had seemingly convinced Donald Trump to drop the act at Windsor. Commentators debated endlessly. Some argued it was overblown, merely a fleeting glance across a dinner table. Others insisted it revealed a profound truth about Catherine's presence and growing stature within the monarchy. Whatever the stance, the fact remained, a moment of body language had stolen the spotlight from speeches, tiaras, and even Trump's own flamboyance. Behind the headlines, there were quieter conversations in diplomatic circles. State visits are about symbolism. After all, they send messages not just through words, but through atmosphere, gestures, and images. What did this moment say? To many, it signaled that the monarchy, so often underestimated in modern politics, still carried weight in unexpected ways. Catherine's ability to steady the room, to subtly shift the tone of an interaction with the President of the United States, underscored the monarchy's enduring role as Britain's most refined form of soft power. For Washington, it was a reminder that in Britain, diplomacy is woven into the very fabric of royal encounters. And for London, it was a reassurance that the younger generation of royals was more than capable of carrying that torch. Publicly, the royals said little about the visit. They never do. Their role is to host with grace, not to commentate. But those close to the palace suggested that Catherine's composure that evening only strengthened her reputation inside the royal household. She had already been admired for her elegance, her empathy, her ability to connect with the public. But Windsor showed another dimension, her authority, her ability to stand firm in the face of the world's most dominant personalities without losing an ounce of grace. For King Charles and Queen Camilla, for Prince William, this was not just a dinner. It was proof that Catherine was ready to step fully into the role of future queen consort, and perhaps one day, queen mother to a future king. Among the public, the fascination was immediate. Social media lit up with clips, commentary, and memes. Admirers praised Catherine's elegance and subtle strength. Critics of Trump saw the exchange as symbolic, quiet dignity triumphing over bluster. Supporters of Trump, meanwhile, downplayed the moment, insisting it was nothing more than casual banter. But even in disagreement, one fact was undeniable. People were talking. And they weren't talking about trade deals, or policy speeches, or even the lavish menu of the banquet. They were talking about Catherine. That was the real power of the evening. She had become the story. What it revealed. So what does this encounter ultimately reveal? More than one might think. It shows us that diplomacy is not always about treaties and signatures. Sometimes it's about human presence, how someone carries themselves, how they respond in moments of tension, how they command respect without demanding it. It shows us that the monarchy, often dismissed as ceremonial, still wields influence in ways that politicians sometimes cannot. Influence rooted not in authority of law, but in authority of image, tradition, and grace. And it shows us something about Catherine herself, that she is not merely a supporting figure in William's shadow, but a force of her own, a woman whose quiet confidence has the ability to hold a room, even when that room contains the President of the United States. A moment for the history books. Years from now, when histories of Trump's presidency are written, Windsor Castle may merit only a few lines. But for royal historians, the evening will linger, not because of the speeches or the tiaras, but because of the way Catherine embodied the monarchy's essence, composure, dignity, and quiet strength. It was a reminder that in a world where noise often dominates, there is still unmatched power in silence. Perhaps that is why the moment continues to resonate. It wasn't just about Trump. It wasn't even just about Catherine. It was about something larger, the endurance of quiet authority in a world increasingly defined by spectacle. Windsor Castle, with its 1,000 years of history, seemed to nod in agreement. Walls that had seen kings crowned and empires fall bore witness once more. Power takes many forms, and sometimes the gentlest is the most enduring. So, what do we take away from Windsor's glittering banquet? That diplomacy is never just about politics, it's about people. That sometimes the strongest voices are the ones that never need to raise themselves. And that a single look, held with grace and conviction, can change the tone of an entire evening. Princess Catherine reminded the world that night why the monarchy still matters. Not because of wealth, or jewels, or pageantry, but because of its ability to wield influence with elegance. And in doing so, she wrote herself a new chapter in royal history, one defined not by fashion headlines, but by quiet power.